What happens when a woman's quiet dignity is mistaken for weakness? In the glittering world of high society galas, where reputations are built and shattered over a glass of champagne, one woman was about to find out. She stood at the podium, a mistress toasting to a future she had stolen. Her voice ringing with triumph through the silent, opulent ballroom. She believed she had won the man, the status, the life. But in the next 60 seconds, the grand doors would swing open, and a force she never knew existed would walk in. Her victory toast would turn to ash in her mouth, proving that some families don't just have money, they have power. This is the story of how a single devastating entrance turned a celebration of betrayal into a masterclass in ruin. The air in the grand ballroom of the Fairmont Royal York was thick with the scent of money, a heady mix of expensive perfume, hothouse flowers, and the subtle crisp aroma of ambition. For Nancy Vance Sterling, it was the smell of another Tuesday, another charity gala, another night spent perfecting the art of the serene smile. Her dress, an Oscar de la Renta in a deep sapphire silk that matched her eyes, was a masterpiece of understated elegance. It didn't scream for attention. It commanded it quietly, much like the woman herself. Beside her, her husband, Richard Sterling, was a portrait of success. His tailored Tom Ford suit fit his athletic frame perfectly, and his smile, which had once been the reason for her own, was now just another part of his public armor. He was the CEO of Sterling Innovations, a tech firm that had exploded onto the scene 5 years ago, and he played the part of the self-made titan with practiced ease. But Nancy knew the truth. She felt it in the way his hand on her back was a proprietary gesture for the cameras, not an affectionate touch. She saw it in the way his eyes darted to his phone, a phantom vibration summoning his attention away from her, always away. The cracks in their 10-year marriage weren't just showing, they were cavernous ravines she had to gracefully step over every single day. "You look breathtaking, darling," Richard murmured, his lips brushing her ear, the gesture as cold as the diamond earrings she wore. "Thank you, Richard," she replied, her voice smooth and even. She didn't return the compliment. She had stopped offering him the genuine parts of herself long ago. Now she saved them for their 7-year-old son Leo, the one pure, untainted thing to come from their union. Tonight was the annual Starlight Foundation Gala, the crown jewel of the city's philanthropic calendar. It was a night for billionaires to write 7-figure checks and for their wives to display the latest haute couture. For Richard, it was a critical networking event. For Nancy, it was a 4-hour performance. She watched him work the room, his laughter a little too loud, his handshakes a little too firm. He was a good actor. He had convinced the world he was a visionary, a family man, a pillar of the community. He had even, for a time, convinced her. But the late-night board meetings, the faint, unfamiliar scent on his collars, and the emotional void that had grown between them, had become a language she was now fluent in. Nancy had known about the affair for 6 months. Her name, she learned from a discreet private investigator, was Amber Collins, a junior marketing associate at Sterling Innovations. 26 years old, raven-haired with a voracious ambition that Nancy recognized because it was the same hunger she'd once seen in a young Richard. The investigator's report was thorough, filled with photos of clandestine lunches and weekend trips to Niagara-on-the-Lake. Each image was a small, sharp cut to her heart. She hadn't confronted him. What was the point? A screaming match, a tearful denial followed by a pathetic temporary reconciliation. Nancy was not a screamer. She was a planner. Her family, the Devereuxs, had taught her that emotion was a luxury one could afford only in private. In public, one held the line. Always. Her family. Richard thought of them as merely well off. He had met her father Augustus and her mother Isabel a handful of times. He saw them as quiet old money types from Boston, politely distant and absorbed in their own world of academia and obscure investments. He had no concept of reality. He had never been to their home, the sprawling ancestral estate in the Berkshires. He had never attended a Devereux family gathering where senators sought her father's counsel and international financiers deferred to her brother Julian's legal opinion. Richard had married Nancy Devereux, but he had never truly met the Devereuxs. He had no idea that their quietness was not meekness. It was the calm at the center of a hurricane. Tonight, as she sipped her water, a small, knowing part of her felt a tremor in the air. Richard had been growing bolder, more reckless. He believed he was untouchable, that his success was entirely his own making. He had forgotten that the initial seed money for sterling innovations. The multi-million-dollar investment that had gotten him off the ground had come from a trust her father had set up for her. He had forgotten whose name had opened the doors to his first crucial investors. He was a king in a castle she had quietly built around him. And tonight, he was about to invite the serpent into the throne room. The ballroom buzzed with polite conversation when the atmosphere subtly shifted. The change was palpable, like a drop in barometric pressure before a storm. Nancy, with the finely tuned social senses of her upbringing, felt it first. She saw the heads near the grand entrance turn, the whispers rippling through the crowd like a contagion. And then she saw her. Amber Collins did not enter a room. She conquered it. She was poured into a crimson Balmain dress that clung to every curve, a slash of defiant color in a sea of elegant jewel tones and classic black. Her hair was a glossy black cascade over her shoulders, and her smile was sharp, predatory. She walked with the unshakable confidence of someone who believed they held all the winning cards. She was everything Nancy was not: loud, ostentatious, and desperate for the spotlight. Richard, who had been deep in conversation with a banking executive, faltered mid-sentence. His eyes found Amber, and for a fleeting, fatal second, his carefully constructed mask slipped. A flicker of possessive pride, of shared conspiracy, passed between them. It was invisible to most, but to Nancy it was as bright and searing as a flash of lightning. The whispers grew louder. People knew. Of course they knew. In their circle, secrets were a form of currency, and Richard's affair was becoming common stock. Friends shot Nancy looks of pity, a sentiment she despised more than infidelity itself. She met their gazes with a calm, unbothered smile, raising her glass in a silent toast to a woman across the room she barely knew. Her composure was her shield and her sword. To show even a crack would be to admit defeat. Amber, escorted by a junior executive who looked utterly terrified to be her +1, made a slow, deliberate circuit of the room. It was a victory lap. Her eyes scanned the crowd, cataloguing the influential faces, but her final destination was clear. She was a heat-seeking missile aimed directly at Table 1, the prime real estate at the front of the ballroom, where Richard and Nancy were seated with the gala's organizers. Richard, a voice purred, dripping with feigned surprise. Amber stood before them, her crimson dress a declaration of war against Nancy's serene sapphire. "Fancy seeing you here." Richard's face flushed. He stood up a little too quickly. "Amber, what a surprise. I didn't know you were a supporter of the Starlight Foundation." "Oh, I have a passion for supporting." worthy causes," she said, her eyes flicking to Nancy for a fraction of a second. The insult was clear. Nancy was the charity case. "And this is Mrs. Sterling. It's an honor to finally meet you. I'm Amber Collins. I work with Richard." Nancy extended a cool, steady hand. Her grip was firm, her smile unwavering. "A pleasure, Miss Collins. Richard has never mentioned you." The quiet, perfectly delivered line was a scalpel, and it found its mark. A flash of anger crossed Amber's face before she masked it with a brilliant smile. She saw Nancy not as a threat, but as a relic, a placeholder about to be discarded. This exchange in her mind was a mere formality before the official transfer of power. For the next hour, Nancy endured the torment. Amber found a seat at an adjacent table, perfectly positioned in Richard's line of sight. They communicated with stolen glances, subtle smiles, and the invisible charged energy of their shared secret. Richard was distracted, clumsy in his conversations, his attention constantly snagged by Amber's magnetic pull. He was a man drowning, and he thought she was his life raft. Nancy ate her pan-seared scallops, discussed summer plans with the mayor's wife, and smiled for photographs. Each moment was an act of supreme self-control. She felt hundreds of eyes on her watching the drama unfold. They were waiting for her to break. They were waiting for the tears, the confrontation, the messy public scene. She would rather die. She was a Devereaux. Her personal pain was not for public consumption. Instead, she focused on a single point in the near future. A moment she had been orchestrating for the past 48 hours with a series of quiet, encrypted phone calls to her brother Julian. The storm was coming. But it was not a storm of her own tears. It was a storm of a different magnitude entirely. And as she watched Amber laugh, her head thrown back in careless triumph, Nancy knew the other woman had no idea she was dancing on the edge of a volcano. The main course plates were cleared, and the auctioneer was preparing to take the stage when Richard stood up, tapping his glass with a fork. The gentle chime silenced the room. A wave of confusion rippled through the audience. It was unusual for a guest, even a major donor, like Richard, to make an impromptu speech. Nancy's blood ran cold. She looked at her husband, at the arrogant set of his jaw and the feverish glint in his eyes. He was drunk not just on the vintage Bordeaux, but on his own perceived power and the proximity of his mistress. He was about to do something irrevocably stupid. "Good evening, everyone," Richard began, his voice amplified by the microphone swiftly provided by a staff member. "I want to thank the Starlight Foundation for another incredible evening. We're all here tonight for a great cause to support the future of our children." He paused, his eyes sweeping the room before landing with deliberate weight on Amber. But sometimes he continued, a strange, self-satisfied smile playing on his lips. "We also have to think about our own futures, about breaking free from the past to embrace a new, more authentic path. It's about finding truth and true happiness." A collective, uneasy silence fell over the ballroom. The subtext was as subtle as a key alarm. This wasn't a speech about charity. It was a public declaration. Nancy felt the stares of 100 people land on her like physical blows. Her face remained a placid mask, but inside her heart hammered against her ribs. "Don't, Richard. Don't do this." He wasn't speaking to the room anymore. He was speaking to Amber. "So I want to propose a toast to new beginnings, to have the courage to follow your heart no matter the cost." He raised his glass. "To the future." He sat down to scattered, hesitant applause. The air was thick with scandal. He had just in front of the city's entire social and financial elite all but announced his intention to leave his wife. Nancy stared at the untouched crème brûlée in front of her. She could feel the pity radiating from those around her, a suffocating blanket of condescension. She wanted to disappear. But then she saw Amber. Buoyed by Richard's reckless speech, Amber Collins saw her moment. This was it. The public coronation. With a look of radiant triumph, she stood up, picking up her own champagne flute. "I'd like to add to that," Amber said, her voice cutting through the awkward murmurs. All eyes snapped to her. This was unprecedented. A junior employee hijacking a C-suite gala. She beamed at Richard, her eyes shining with adoration and victory. Richard is right. The future is what matters. And it takes a truly brave man to choose happiness over obligation. The word obligation hung in the air, a direct, poisoned arrow aimed at Nancy. Amber then turned her gaze for the first time fully and directly upon the woman she was replacing. There was no pity in her eyes, only the cold, hard glint of victory. Some people are content to live in the past, holding on to titles and arrangements that have long since expired. Amber continued, her voice dripping with condescending sweetness. But the future belongs to those who are bold enough to seize it. I'm toasting to a man who finally found the courage to do just that. To Richard. And to us. She raised her glass high, the crimson of her dress like a smear of blood against the elegant backdrop. To us. The words echoed in the cavernous, tomb-like silence of the ballroom. She had not only acknowledged the affair, she had celebrated it. She had toasted to the destruction of a marriage, to the humiliation of the wife sitting just feet away. Richard, looking pale and suddenly aware of the magnitude of his mistake, didn't know what to do. He looked from his triumphant mistress to his silent wife. Amber held her pose, her glass in the air, a triumphant smirk on her lips, waiting for the applause that would legitimize her coup. But no applause came. There was only a shocked, horrified silence, and the sight of Nancy Vance Sterling, sitting perfectly still, her expression unreadable, her sapphire eyes fixed on her husband with an intensity that promised not tears, but a reckoning. The mistress had toasted to her victory. The room held its breath, waiting for the wife to fall apart. In the deafening silence that followed Amber's toast, every eye in the room was locked on Nancy. They expected a scene. They craved it. The drama was the real currency of the evening, far more valuable than the silent auction items. They anticipated the tremor in the lip, the glistening of tears, a shouted accusation, or a dignified but hasty retreat. Nancy gave them none of it. She remained perfectly unnervingly still. She did not look at Amber. To acknowledge her would be to grant her significance. Instead, her gaze remained fixed on Richard. The serene smile she had worn all evening was gone, replaced by an expression of profound and chilling emptiness. It was a look that stripped him bare, peeling back the layers of his success and confidence to reveal the small, weak man underneath. In her eyes, he saw not a wife he had wronged, but a stranger he had fundamentally misjudged. Slowly, deliberately, Nancy picked up her linen napkin. She dabbed at the corners of her mouth, a gesture so normal, so mundane, it was utterly jarring in the high-stakes emotional theater of the moment. She then placed the napkin neatly beside her plate. She turned her head slightly, her gaze sweeping over the faces at her table, the gala chairwoman whose mouth was agape, the bank president who was studiously examining his dessert fork, their wives who looked at her with a mixture of horror and morbid fascination. She gave them a small, tight nod, an apology for the vulgar disruption they had been forced to witness. It was an act of breathtaking control. At that moment, she wasn't the victim. She was the epicenter of a power they couldn't comprehend, the quiet heart of a coming hurricane. Her stillness was more terrifying than any scream. It was the eerie calm of a deep ocean before a tsunami. Amber's triumphant smile began to falter. The silence was not the stunned admiration she had expected. It was the suffocating silence of judgment. Her hand, still holding the champagne flute aloft, began to tremble. The crowd was not with her. She had miscalculated, assuming they would rally behind the narrative of passionate true love. Instead, she had simply revealed herself to be classless and cruel. She slowly lowered her glass, a flush of uncertainty creeping up her neck. Richard felt a primal fear seize him. He had seen Nancy angry before, but that was a familiar, manageable fire. This was different. This was the absolute zero of her rage, a coldness so profound it burned. He had not just broken their vows, he had publicly humiliated a woman who he was beginning to suspect he did not know at all. The vague, polite stories about her family, their quiet life in Boston, it all felt like a flimsy stage set in the face of her terrifying composure. "Well," Nancy finally said, her voice clear and steady, cutting through the tension. It wasn't loud, but it carried to every corner of the silent room. She didn't look at Richard or Amber. She addressed the table at large. "It appears the evening's entertainment has taken an unexpected turn." She pushed her chair back, the sound of its legs scraping against the polished floor, unnaturally loud. She stood, her posture perfect, her sapphire dress shimmering under the chandeliers. "If you'll excuse me," she stated, her voice devoid of any emotion. This was the moment they expected her to flee. But she didn't move towards the exit. Instead, she turned her back on her husband and his mistress, and took a single deliberate step away from the table, facing the grand gilded doors at the far end of the ballroom. She stood there alone in the open space, a solitary, elegant figure. She wasn't running. She was waiting. A nervous cough broke the silence. The auctioneer looked uncertainly towards the stage manager. The entire event had ground to a halt, held captive by a domestic drama that had spiraled into a public spectacle. Richard started to rise to go to her to say something, what he had no idea. But a sudden resonant thud stopped him. It was the sound of the grand ballroom doors being pushed open from the outside. Two uniformed hotel staff held the towering doors, swinging them inward to their full dramatic width. The light from the grand foyer spilled into the ballroom, silhouetting the figures who were about to enter. Nancy didn't turn. She didn't have to. She knew who was coming. She had made the call. Amber Collins, feeling the first real pang of fear, watched the entrance confused. Who could possibly be arriving this late? Richard Sterling, his heart beginning to pound, a frantic, terrified rhythm against his ribs, stared at the doorway, a dawning, sickening horror beginning to curdle in his stomach. The quiet, polite, well-off family from Boston. The people he had dismissed. The people he had insulted through their daughter. The stillness was over. The storm had just made landfall. The first to enter was a man who moved with the unhurried grace of someone who had never in his life been told to wait. He was in his late 60s, with a mane of silver hair and a face that looked like it had been carved from granite. He wore a simple, exquisitely cut, dark suit, but he carried an aura of absolute authority that made the tuxedos around him look like cheap costumes. This was Augustus Devereux. His eyes, the same deep sapphire as his daughter's, swept the room once, taking in the scene with a cold, analytical precision. They did not register the crowd. They assessed it. Flanking him was his wife, Isabel Devereux. She was the very definition of old-world elegance, draped in pearls, and a Chanel gown that was likely older than Amber Collins, but looked infinitely more valuable. Her expression was one of mild aristocratic disappointment, as if she had just found a crack in a priceless piece of porcelain. But it was the man who followed them, who made Richard Sterling's blood turn to ice water in his veins. Julian Devereux, Nancy's older brother. Richard had met him only once at the wedding a decade ago. Julian was a senior partner at Cromwell & Swain, a law firm so powerful it didn't represent clients. It represented dynasties and governments. He was tall, impeccably dressed, and possessed a shark-like stillness that was far more intimidating than his father's overt power. His eyes found Richard's across the ballroom, and in them there was no anger. There was something much worse, a calm, professional promise of annihilation. The trio didn't stride into the room. They advanced. The ambient chatter, which had just begun to tentatively resume, died instantly. A new kind of silence fell, one of awe and fear. People didn't just know who the Devereuxs were. The right people understood what they were. They were not merely rich. They were foundational. They owned the banks that underwrote the loans for the companies run by the men in this room. They sat on the boards of the institutions that governed global markets. They were the discreet, invisible architects of the world these people merely inhabited. The gala's chairman, a man named Marcus Thorne, who ran a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund, practically scrambled from his chair, his face pale. Augustus. My God, what an honor. We weren't expecting you, he stammered, rushing to greet them. Augustus Devereux gave him a curt nod, his eyes never leaving the tableau at the front of the room. We weren't planning on attending Marcus. We were merely in town and came to collect our daughter. The words "our daughter" landed like hammer blows. In that instant, the connection was made across the entire room. Nancy Vance Sterling, the quiet, elegant wife, was Nancy Devereux. That Devereux. A shockwave of understanding passed through the gala. The looks of pity that had been directed at Nancy now transformed into looks of utter terror on behalf of Richard. They were watching a man who had just, in the most public and insulting way possible, declared war on a superpower he didn't even know existed. Richard felt the floor drop out from under him. His entire life, his company, his success, it all flashed before his eyes. Sterling Innovations had been growing, but it was still vulnerable. It relied on a complex web of credit lines, venture capital, and strategic partnerships. A web he now realized the Devereux family could sever with a single phone call. The name on the initial seed investment check suddenly burned in his memory, the A.J. Devereux Family Trust. He had thought it was just some quaint family fund. He was a fool, an absolute, blithering fool. Amber Collins was frozen, her mind struggling to process the scene. She recognized the name Devereux from the society pages, but the context was abstract. She saw three imposing, well-dressed, older people. She saw the deference, the fear from men she knew to be titans. She looked at Nancy standing calm and resolute as her family approached, and for the first time Amber realized she wasn't in a love triangle. She was a foot soldier who had just wandered onto a nuclear testing site. The Devereux family did not stop to talk to anyone. They moved through the parted crowd like a ship cutting through water, their destination, the epicenter of the humiliation, Table 1. They walked past the stage, past the auction items, their progress measured and inexorable. They came to a stop before Nancy, forming a protective phalanx around her. Augustus placed a hand on his daughter's shoulder. Isabel's eyes met hers, and in that silent glance, a lifetime of understanding and support was conveyed. And then as one, they turned their attention to the two people still sitting at the table now, utterly isolated and exposed under the weight of 100 horrified stares. The reckoning had begun. There was no shouting. The Devereux family did not operate with such crude instruments. Their power was in their quiet, devastating precision. The reckoning was not a storm of fury. It was a surgical strike executed with the cold, impassive skill of a master assassin. Augustus Devereux's gaze settled on Richard. He did not speak. He simply looked at the man who had betrayed his daughter, and in that look was the full, crushing weight of his disappointment and contempt. It was the look of a god inspecting an insect just before it is erased from existence. Richard Sterling, the self-proclaimed titan of tech, visibly shrank in his chair, a cold sweat beading on his forehead. Every ounce of his bravado, his charm, his arrogance, evaporated under that silent, patriarchal judgment. While his father held Richard pinned with his stare, Julian Devereux moved. He walked around the table and stood behind Richard's chair, leaning down slightly as if to share a pleasant confidence. His voice was a low, cultured murmur, audible only to Richard, and perhaps the terrified guests on either side. Sterling Julian began his tone disarmingly calm. "I just finished a call with David Pembroke at Morgan Stanley. You know David, don't you? He manages your primary line of credit. He was very interested to hear about the instability in your personal life. He sends his regards and has scheduled an immediate review of your company's risk profile for 9 a.m. tomorrow." Richard's blood ran cold. An immediate review was code for a recall. His entire operation was leveraged against that line of credit. Julian continued, his voice as smooth as silk. "And Michael Brown at Omnicorp, your partner for the new chipset manufacturing. He and my father sit on the museum board together. Small world. Michael is a great believer in family values. I suspect he'll find the moral turpitude clause in your contract quite compelling. Expect his call before breakfast." Each sentence was a perfectly aimed shot, striking a critical pillar of Richard's empire. He had spent years building these relationships, this company. Julian Devereux was dismantling it in under 60 seconds with a few quiet words. "And those government contracts you're bidding on for Sterling?" Secure, Julian added, his voice dropping even lower, becoming a near whisper of pure menace. "The ones that would triple your company's valuation. The selection committee is chaired by Senator Carlson. Nancy is his daughter's godmother. I think you can consider your bid withdrawn." Julian straightened up, a faint, cruel smile touching his lips. "You built your house on my family's land, Richard. You seem to have forgotten we can revoke the lease at any time. Enjoy your dessert." He had not raised his voice. He had not made a threat. He had simply stated a series of facts that, when assembled, spelled out Richard's complete and utter ruin. While Julian dismantled Richard's professional life, Isabel Devereux addressed the other problem. She turned her cool, discerning eyes upon Amber Collins. Amber, who had moments ago been preening in her victory, now looked like a frightened child. Isabel did not approach her. She spoke from where she stood, her voice clear and carrying a masterclass in public dismissal. "Miss Collins, is it?" "It," Isabel asked, her tone suggesting she was addressing a particularly impertinent member of the catering staff. Amber nodded, unable to speak. "My family has a saying," Isabel continued, her gaze sweeping over Amber's garish dress and overly ambitious jewelry. "A woman who has to buy her own furniture will never understand the value of an heirloom." "You are a piece of new furniture, Miss Collins, flashy, temporary, and ultimately destined for the curb. You mistook a business arrangement for a love story, and you mistook my daughter's decency for weakness. These are the fatal, common mistakes of your kind." Isabel's eyes flickered to the other women at the nearby tables, the wives, the matriarchs of their own powerful families. She was not just speaking to Amber. She was passing a sentence that would be upheld in every salon, boardroom, and country club in the city. Amber Collins was no longer a scandalous rival. She was a social pariah, a non-person. "You have your moment in the spotlight," Isabel concluded, her voice laced with icy finality. "I do hope you enjoy it. It will be your last." With that, the Devereux matriarch turned her back on Amber, the dismissal so absolute it was as if she had ceased to exist. Amber sat there, her face ashen, her cheap victory toast having cost her everything she had, so desperately craved a future, a reputation, a place in this world. The reckoning was complete. It had been swift, silent, and total. The Devereux family had not caused a scene. They had restored order. Augustus offered his arm to Nancy. Isabel took her other arm. Julian stood behind them, a silent sentinel. Together, the family, whole and unbreakable, turned and walked towards the grand exit. They moved with the same quiet, inexorable purpose with which they had entered, parting the stunned crowd before them. They left behind the smoldering ruins of 2 lives, a silent ballroom full of witnesses, and a lesson that would be whispered about for years to come. Never, ever mistake a quiet woman for a weak one. You never know who her family is. The exit of the Devereux family was as impactful as their entrance. As the grand doors closed behind them, it was as if the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. The spell was broken, and a cacophony of frantic whispers erupted. Richard Sterling remained frozen in his chair, his face a ghastly shade of white. Julian's words echoed in his mind, a death knell for his career. He looked across the table and saw the gala chairman, Marcus Thorne, pointedly avoiding his gaze. He saw the averted eyes of men he had called his peers, his friends. He was no longer one of them. He was a liability, a cautionary tale. His gaze fell upon Amber. She was staring at her half-empty champagne glass, the symbol of her ruin. Her face was streaked with tears, her carefully applied makeup a tragic mess. Her triumph had lasted less than 5 minutes. She looked up at him, her eyes pleading, searching for reassurance. But Richard had none to give. He felt nothing for her now, but a venomous resentment. She was the garish, stupid catalyst for his downfall. She had goaded him, and like a fool he had followed. Their shared glances were no longer conspiratorial. They were the panicked looks of 2 co-conspirators about to be sentenced. They were left alone at the table, a toxic island in the middle of a room that was rapidly distancing itself from them. The mayor's wife suddenly remembered a pressing engagement. The bank president had to make an urgent call. Within minutes, the seats around them were empty. They were pariahs. Meanwhile, in the marble-floored grand foyer, Nancy felt the cool night air on her skin as the hotel doorman held the entrance open for her family. For the first time all evening, a genuine emotion broke through her carefully controlled facade. It wasn't sadness or anger. It was a relief, a profound, cleansing relief. "Are you all right, my dear Augustus?" asked his voice, softer now, the granite of his expression softening with paternal concern. Nancy leaned her head against her father's shoulder. "I am now." They stood for a moment under the glittering porte-cochere as a black, discreetly armored Cadillac Escalade pulled silently to the curb. It was Julian who spoke next, turning to his sister. "The lawyers will be in touch with his office in the morning," he said simply. "We will handle the dissolution of the company and the divorce. You won't have to speak to him again unless you choose to." Leo was all Nancy asked her son, her only concern. "He's with his nanny at the penthouse suite we keep at the Pierre," Isabel said, squeezing her hand. "He's sleeping soundly. We'll all go there." As Nancy slid into the plush leather seat of the vehicle, she looked back at the Grand Hotel. She had walked in as Mrs. Richard Sterling, a woman defined by her husband's success, a wife enduring a quiet humiliation. She was leaving as Nancy Devereux, a woman defined by her own strength and the unshakable foundation of her family. The days that followed were a blur of legal precision. Richard Sterling's world collapsed just as Julian had predicted. His credit was pulled. His key partnership was terminated. His company, Sterling Innovations, once the darling of the tech world, was carved up and sold for parts to cover its debts, with a Devereux-owned private equity firm buying the most valuable patents for pennies on the dollar. Richard was left with nothing but the public shame of his hubris. Amber Collins vanished. Fired from her job and socially blacklisted, she left the city. Her name becoming a whisper, a ghost story told to ambitious young women about the dangers of overplaying their hand. Nancy never looked back. She and Leo moved back to Boston for a time, healing in the quiet embrace of the Devereux estate. But she did not remain in hiding. A year later, she re-emerged not as a socialite, but as a force. Using her inheritance and the name she had once hidden, she launched the Devereux Vance Foundation, an organization dedicated to empowering women in tech funding, the very kind of startups her ex-husband had once run. She became known for her sharp intellect, her quiet philanthropy, and her unerring eye for talent. She was no longer just a Devereux by name. She was a Devereux by action, a matriarch in the making. She had walked through the fire of betrayal and emerged not burned but forged. Her silence had been her shield, her composure, her weapon, and her family her army. She had proven that in a world of loud victories and flashy triumphs, the most devastating power is the one you never see coming. 2 years passed. The Starlight Foundation. Gala, where Richard's empire had crumbled, became a legend in the city's social lore, a whispered cautionary tale about hubris and hidden power. In that time, Nancy had not just recovered, she had transformed. The Devereux Vance Foundation was now a formidable force in the tech and philanthropic worlds. Nancy, its founder and driving force, was no longer seen as Richard Sterling's wronged wife, but as a visionary in her own right. Her sapphire eyes, once clouded with quiet pain, now held the sharp, focused clarity of a leader. Tonight was the inaugural Devereux Vance Foundation Bala, held in the very same ballroom at the Fairmont. It was a deliberate choice. Nancy was not a woman who ran from ghosts. She believed in reclaiming spaces in rewriting history. The ballroom, once the scene of her greatest humiliation, was now filled with the energy of her greatest triumph. Dressed in a striking emerald green gown by a designer her foundation had sponsored, she moved through the crowd not as a guest, but as a queen in her own court. Her son Leo, now 9, was spending the evening with his grandparents. He was a happy, bright boy, but recently he had begun asking questions. Questions about his father. Why didn't he see him? Where did he live? Nancy answered with carefully curated truths, protecting him from the ugliness of reality. But she knew a day would come when curated truths would not be enough. It was during a brief lull, as she stood near the terrace overlooking the city lights, that her assistant, a sharp young woman named Chloe, approached her with a hesitant expression. "Mrs. Devereux Vance," Chloe began. "I'm so sorry to interrupt, but this was delivered by a courier. The man was..." insistent that you receive it tonight." She handed Nancy a simple, unadorned white envelope. Nancy's name was written on the front in a familiar, slanting script that made her stomach clench. It was Richard's handwriting. Excusing herself, she stepped out onto the quiet terrace, the cool night air a welcome shock. Her hands were perfectly steady as she opened the letter. "Nancy, I know I have no right to contact you. I know the sound of my name is likely a poison to you, and for that I am truly sorry. I am not writing to ask for forgiveness. I know that is impossible. I am not writing to ask for money. I have learned to live with what I have, which is nothing. These past 2 years have been a journey through hell, a hell of my own making. I have lost everything, and I deserved to. In losing it all, I finally began to see you, to see what I threw away, to see the man I had become. I am in therapy. I am working a menial job. I am, for the first time in my life, honest with myself. My reason for writing is Leo. I know he must be asking questions. I dream of him at night, and I wake up knowing I am a ghost to my own son. I am asking you, Nancy, for 5 minutes. Not for my sake, but for his. So that one day, when he asks what happened to his father, you can tell him that his father had the courage to look his mother in the eye and admit his sins. So that I can apologize to you, the woman I wronged more than any other. I will be at the cafe in the Art Gallery of Ontario this Friday at 10 a.m. If you do not come, I will understand, and I will never bother you again. I have no power to harm you, and no desire to. I am just a man with a past that is too heavy to carry alone any longer. Yours with deepest regret, Richard." Nancy read the letter twice. The prose was pitch perfect. It was humble, regretful, and masterfully centered on the one vulnerability she possessed her son. A part of her, the cold, analytical Devereux part, saw it as a calculated, manipulative ploy. But another softer part, the part that had once loved this man, that had built a life and had a child with him, felt a flicker of something dangerously close to pity. That evening she called her brother. Julian's response was immediate and visceral. "Burn it," he said, his voice cold. "He's a predator, Nancy. This is what they do. They test the fences for weaknesses. You show him 1 ounce of compassion, and he will bleed you dry. Let him rot." "He mentioned Leo," she said quietly. "He's using Leo." Julian countered, his voice sharp. "It's the oldest trick in the book. What will you tell Leo?" "That his father is a failure who lives in a 1-room apartment and busses tables. Seeing him will do more harm than good. You are Leo's rock. Don't let Richard bring a sledgehammer anywhere near that foundation." Nancy knew Julian was right. Logically, he was right. But her heart, an organ she had learned to distrust, felt a pull. Was it truly strength to build an impenetrable wall? Or was there a greater strength in facing a demon and proving it no longer had any power over you? Friday morning came crisp and clear. At 9:55 a.m., Nancy Vance Devereux walked into the sunlit cafe at the art gallery, her expression unreadable. She saw him in a corner booth. The change was shocking. He was thin, his expensive suit replaced by a simple worn sweater. His face was etched with lines of worry she had never seen before. He looked up and saw her, and his eyes filled with a raw, desperate hope. "Nancy," he breathed, standing. "You came." "I'm here, Richard," she said, her voice cool and steady as she sat opposite him. "You have 5 minutes." His performance was flawless. He spoke of his therapy sessions, of the shame that was his constant companion. He never once made an excuse for his behavior. He took full responsibility for the affair, for his arrogance, for the public humiliation he had put her through. He painted a picture of a man utterly broken and slowly, painfully rebuilding himself from the ground up. I destroyed the best thing in my life for a cheap thrill and an ego boost, he said, his voice cracking. There isn't a day I don't regret it. I see now that my success, it was never truly mine. It was built on your family's generosity and your quiet support. I was a fool who thought the house he lived in was a castle he had built. Nancy listened, her hands resting calmly in her lap. She felt nothing. The man opposite her was a stranger, and his confession was like a story about people she didn't know. The emotional wounds had long since scarred over, leaving her impervious. Then came the pivot. It was subtle, masterful. "I'm not looking for a handout," he said, looking down at his hands. "I'm trying to make amends, not just with words. I've been volunteering at a youth center. These kids, they're brilliant, but they have nothing. I've been teaching them to code on old donated computers. It's the one thing I have left to give. I'm trying to start a small non-profit, a coding camp, just to give a few of them a leg up." He looked at her, his eyes glistening. "I know it's audacious to even think this, but I see what you're doing with your foundation. It's incredible. You're changing lives. My little project is nothing in comparison, but it's honest work. It's the only legacy I have left for Leo to know." He didn't ask her for money. He didn't have to. He had laid the bait perfectly, appealing to her philanthropic mission and her love for her son. He was asking her to invest in his redemption. "I'll have to think about it, Richard," she said, her voice neutral. She stood. "My 5 minutes are up." She walked away without a backward glance, leaving him in the booth, his expression a perfect blend of hope and sorrow. The moment she was in her car, she called Julian. "Run a full check on him," she said. "Everything. Bank accounts, employment, residence, and any charitable organization registered under his name." The report came back less than 24 hours later. It was worse than she had imagined. Richard was living in a squalid bachelor apartment on the edge of the city. He wasn't a busboy. He was unemployed, and had been for 6 months. He was drowning in debt, not to banks, but to illegal loan sharks. There was no youth center. There was no coding camp. It was all a lie. A carefully crafted narrative for an audience of one. The cold fury that filled her was not for the deception, but for his audacity in trying to use their son as a pawn in his pathetic con. Julian was right. A snake is always a snake. She was preparing to have her legal team send a final binding cease and desist order when a call came through to her private line. The number was blocked. "Is this Nancy Vance?" a woman's voice asked. It was raspy thin, and held a note of frayed desperation that Nancy recognized instantly. "This is her." "Who is this?" "It's Amber," the voice said. "Amber Collins." Nancy frozen. "I have nothing to say to you." "Please don't hang up," Amber pleaded, and the sound was no longer of a rival, but of someone at the very end of their rope. I heard he contacted you." "Richard, I need to warn you. It's not about a coding camp. He's in trouble, deep trouble, and he's trying to get to something he thinks you can access." A long silence stretched between them. "What are you talking about?" Nancy finally asked. "The final months at Sterling Innovations." Amber's voice trembled. He was panicking. He knew things were getting shaky. He thought your family might be pulling back support. So he did something. He set up a series of shell corporations. He siphoned nearly $8 million from the company planning to run. With me. He was going to leave you with a bankrupt company and disappear. Nancy felt the floor drop away for a second time in her life. The betrayal wasn't just infidelity. It was a premeditated, cold-blooded theft. He had been planning to gut the company her family had funded and leave her with the wreckage. The money was wired to an offshore account. Amber continued, her voice gaining a frantic speed. But when your family moved so fast, everything was frozen in litigation. The accounts were flagged. He could never access it, but the account requires 2 digital key holders to unlock in case of a legal override. Him and you. It was set up when the company was founded, a standard spousal clause for asset protection. He thinks if he can convince you he's a changed man, you might sign a document, something you think is for his charity, that would actually grant him access. He needs your signature to steal the money he already stole once. The full monstrous scope of his deception was finally laid bare. The toast at the gala hadn't been a foolish, impulsive declaration of love. It had been the victory speech of a thief delivered 1 minute too soon. His recent letter, his performance at the cafe, it was all the second act of the same grift. Why are you telling me this? Amber, Nancy asked, her voice dangerously quiet. Because the men he owes money to are not kind men, she whispered. And because he left me with nothing. Nancy, he used me, and when it all went wrong, he threw me away like trash. You won. Your family won. I don't want him to win. Not ever. A profound final clarity settled over Nancy. This was the last echo, the final ghost, and she knew exactly what to do. She didn't just send a cease and desist. She forwarded Julian the recording of her call with Amber. Within hours, the Devereux legal team, armed with this new information, filed a criminal complaint with the district attorney's office for wire fraud and embezzlement. 2 days later, Richard Sterling was arrested in his rundown apartment. The story hit the financial news not as a marital spat, but as a major case of corporate fraud. His last desperate play had not won him his freedom. It had earned him a prison cell. In exchange for her testimony, Amber Collins received immunity and a small one-time payment from a Devereux discretionary fund, enough to disappear and start a new life free from Richard's toxic orbit. Nancy stood once more on the terrace of the Fairmont, looking out at the city that was now hers. She felt no triumph, no joy, only a quiet, resolute peace. She had faced the past, dissected its lies, and protected her future. Her father called her that evening. His voice held no surprise, only a deep, abiding respect. "You handled it perfectly," Nancy Augustus said. "You are truly your mother's daughter." And in that moment, Nancy knew she was no longer just a Vance or a Sterling. She was a Devereux, a name she now defined for herself not by the power she had inherited, but by the wisdom and strength with which she wielded it. The storm was finally completely over, and so the story of Richard Sterling and Amber Collins serves as a stark reminder. Never underestimate the woman who meets chaos with calm. Nancy's story isn't just about the satisfying downfall of a cheating husband and his arrogant mistress. It's a testament to the incredible power of quiet strength, dignity, and knowing your own worth, even when others try to devalue it. She proved that true power isn't about making a scene. It's about having the strength to rewrite the entire script, ensuring the final act belongs to you. Karma in this story wasn't just a fantasy. It was a well-executed strategy delivered by a family that protects its own. If you were captivated by this story of justice served cold and a woman's rise from the ashes of betrayal, please let us know. Hit that like button, share this video with someone who loves a story of epic karma, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more tales of empowerment and sweet, sweet revenge. What did you think of the Devereaux family's entrance? Let us know in the comments below.